You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a few weeks since we've been in our Exodus study, but we are hopping back in today and finishing up chapter 5. You'll recall from the last episode in this series, we were in Exodus chapter 5, covering the first 10 verses when Moses and Aaron approach Pharaoh for the first time with the demand to let the people go out. Not necessarily for good, but specifically for a 3-day festival. And Pharaoh responds saying that he does not know Yahweh. And we talked about the implications of that, and then his requirement that the people make bricks without having straw provided for them. And we're going to see this week that Pharaoh doesn't just stop there. What will follow in these next verses is a textbook demonstration of how oppressive systems respond to being challenged. Not with reasoned debate or a willingness to listen, but with escalation and division. And we kind of expect that from the ruler of a nation, but this happens in a smaller scale with everyday people too. When you are presented with somebody challenging you, suggesting that something you have done is wrong, this is where we left off last time, you are presented with two options. Are you going to dig your heels in and make things worse for everyone, or are you going to be willing to admit that there is a possibility you could have done something wrong? I think we all already know which option Pharaoh is going with. Now, the Hebrew text this week is particularly rich with literary devices, wordplay, constructions that English often flattens. So this is the stuff I love getting to talk about here, and hopefully you love getting to learn about. So let's examine together how the original text actually reads and what it reveals about Pharaoh's mechanics of oppression. Let's start off reading in verse 10. I think I may have said before we read the first 10 previously, it was actually verse 9 we ended in, so I'm going to pick up on verse 10 here. And the taskmasters of the people went out, and their officers, and they spoke to the people, saying, Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go you, get you straw where you can find it. Yet not aught of your work will be diminished. So the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble instead of straw. And the taskmasters hastened them, saying, Fulfill your works, your daily tasks, as when there was straw. All right, let's pause there for the moment. That's stopping in verse 13. I'm guessing not too many of us here are skilled in ancient brick making. I don't think that's on anyone's resume who's listening to this episode. If it is, I'd love to hear why. Please reach out and let me know. But you might be going, what's the big deal about not having straw? Well, I linked to an article, just a Wikipedia entry actually, in the last episode for Chapter 5, that just gives a little bit of explanation on what ancient brickmaking would have looked like. I know some people get pissy about using Wikipedia as a source, but it can help if you're just pointing people in the direction of where to do further research. So straw is almost like the ancient equivalent of putting rebar in concrete today. It helped the bricks to dry more quickly and also to be a little bit sturdier once they are actually used. So when Pharaoh requires the people to make bricks without straw being provided, he's not just hurting them, he's actually hurting himself in the long run because it means that the quality of the work is going to be diminished. But he doesn't seem to realize that or to care. This is just a side note I should throw in here. I think we may have touched on this in the introductory episode, the stuff you don't know, but we don't really know what the Israelites in these chapters were building in Egypt. There's only a quick passing reference that mentions 2 storehouse cities that they helped to build, but despite popular opinion, there is actually no reference to their building pyramids, and depending on which time period you believe this was, see our previous discussions on why there's so much up in the air about which time period it was in, it's entirely possible that the pyramids were already built by this point. So there's nothing that really tells us what projects they were working on. Was it government projects? Were they building like their own housing quarters there? Were they doing building projects just for people like contract labor? We don't really know. I find verse 11's wording really fascinating because this is the kind of thing I'm talking about where the Hebrew authors will just throw in these little grammatical and literary masterpieces where they're just giving you these little Easter eggs for the really attentive readers. What was it that Moses and Aaron were asking Pharaoh for? to let the people go, right? Well, in verse 11, did you see what Pharaoh said to them? He said, "Go ye, go." He tells them to go, but not to leave. So it's almost ironic how he gives Moses what he asked for, but not in the way that he asked for it. It kind of reminds me of a couple of old, like, 1990s crappy horror movies. I'm really into, like, the B-level, really bad quality horror movies, and there's two different series that came to mind with this. One is Leprechaun, and the other is Wishmaster. Wishmaster is significantly better than Leprechaun, but if you are into old crappy movies, both of those are quite entertaining at times, and quite not entertaining for the rest of them. But they both play on the idea of somebody having a wish and some sort of a magical being who can grant the wish, but finds a workaround. You know, it's the typical, like, ask a genie, you get 3 wishes, but they give you what you ask for, but there's always a loophole, there's always a catch, there's always something in the way you put it that isn't specific enough to where you get hurt in the process too. And that's kind of the way I see Pharaoh playing with the Israelites here. He's like, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Yet in verse 12, when the people are scattered abroad, Robert Alter notes that even in this measure of aggravated oppression, the language of the story picks up on the initial imagery of animal-like proliferation, which in turn harks back to the injunction in the creation story to fill the land or earth. End quote. So Alter has drawn a lot of attention to this, and I've tried to bring in some of these quotes as we've gone through the episodes here, because I think this connection here is really cool. The authors keep trying to tie us back to Genesis, and particularly the garden when God told the first man and woman to be fruitful and multiply and spread over the land, and that is what these Israelites keep doing. No matter what Pharaoh is doing, no matter how much Pharaoh is turning Egypt into the next Babylon of the story, the next big bad guy, the Israelites keep finding Eden where they are. They continue to have many children, and now, even as Pharaoh has cursed them to have to scatter across the land and find their own ingredients? That's not the right word. Components, I guess we should say, for making bricks. They are filling the land, just like the Eden blessing was, so it's rather ironic. Now, verse 12 may sound a little bit different depending on which translation you're using. Some of the older ones, like the King James, New King James, Authorized Version, they're going to say to gather stubble instead of straw. But a lot of more modern versions will say for. They had to gather stubble for straw. I've talked before a little bit here on the podcast because I try not to get too deep into the weeds when it comes to Hebrew grammar, but there's only a couple of prepositions in the Hebrew language, and one of them is just the letter L, lamed, and it can mean any number of things depending on the context. That's what we have going on here. So it's a translation decision. It's not like there's a difference in manuscripts or something here. It's just the translator saying, how should we translate this very versatile preposition in this particular instance? And for seems to make more sense here, because they had to use stubble for straw. You say, well, what's the big difference? Well, instead of suggest that stubble is something entirely different from straw, whereas it seems like the stubble is just like the rejects of the straw, the little chaff that blew off when they carried the straw away. So they're using a shoddier product, not an entirely different product. It seems like the Egyptians probably had some sort of a designated area from which they gathered straw, and when Pharaoh demanded the people find their own straw, he likely shut off access to those areas, forcing them to gather whatever stubble they could find for straw. I'll just remind you from last time, there is a very serious psychological dimension to what Pharaoh is doing here, because when people are desperate for resources just to meet quota at work, they don't have the bandwidth for organizing resistance. The system creates its own division. So he's being very smart in the way that he's trying to break up this rebellion. When verse 13 reads that the taskmasters hasted them, as the old King James says, and yes, that basically means hastened at that point, it's actually a relatively rare Hebrew word within the Bible. It's the word atzim, and it's only used 10 times in the entirety of the Tanakh. Only one time in the story up until this point, and that's back when the angels appeared to Lot in Sodom and hastened him out of the city. So the taskmasters are rushing the people around like the angels had to rush Lot out of Sodom. Let's take a real quick breather, and we'll come back for the next section in the chapter. Picking up in verse 14 now. And the officers of the children of Israel, which Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten, and demanded, Wherefore have you not fulfilled your task in making brick both yesterday and today as before? Then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried unto Pharaoh, saying, Why are you dealing like this with your servants? There's no straw given to your servants, and yet they say to us, Make brick. And look, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. But he said, You're idle, you're idle. Therefore, that's why you say, Go, let us go, and do sacrifice to Yahweh. Go now, therefore, and work, for there will be no straw given to you, yet you will deliver the tale of bricks. And the officers of the children of Israel did see that they were in evil case, after it was said, You will not minish aught from your bricks of your daily task. And we'll pause there in verse 19. These verses introduce us to some often overlooked characters in the story, and that's the officers of the children of Israel, as it's worded in the King James, or we might more modernly say the Hebrew foremen. Now, this is not explicitly laid out in the text, but it certainly seems to be the case that the Egyptians were using Israelites to oversee the slavery of their own brethren. If you remember back to the first couple of episodes when I was talking about the Hebrew midwives, and it wasn't very clear at first whether that meant midwives who were Hebrew or midwives who are to the Hebrews, like who only serviced the Hebrew women, but it seemed in that case that it was actually more than likely Egyptian women or, of some other nationality than Hebrew, rather than saying that they actually were Hebrews themselves. In this case, it seems like when they're saying the officers of the children of Israel were the Israelite officers, that these are actually themselves Israelites. These people were then in a very uncomfortable spot. They probably got slightly better treatment from Egypt when they cooperated, but were then shunned by their fellow Jews. Can you imagine what a no-win situation that is? Perhaps for your own survival or the survival of your family, you try to help your oppressors in order to get a little bit better treatment, but then you're betraying your own family, your own kinsmen, your own countrymen. But if you stand on their side, you're not doing anyone any good because then you're just getting oppressed along with everyone else. It's a no-win situation. I can't help but think that maybe these foremen were the source of some of the complaining that would come about later during the wilderness wanderings, where they saw themselves as leaders of the people and possibly even representatives or maybe even martyrs for their own people, because it does sound like they would get beaten on behalf of the people when the work wasn't done well. But it also wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think that maybe the people didn't like them and would think like, we didn't ask you to take on this role, and maybe they saw them as traitors. It reminds me very much of the situation of people like Zacchaeus in the New Testament, or Matthew, who were these tax collectors who were of Jewish descent, but worked for Rome, and they wouldn't necessarily say it as being against their own people, but that's often how the people took it themselves. Some later traditions would even suggest that these foremen were heroes who took beatings to protect their people, though that interpretation is not explicitly stated in the text. What is clear is that they lived in the gap between oppressor and oppressed, basically a middle management position that's psychologically devastating for everyone involved. When they finally approach Pharaoh, and I gotta say, verse 16 takes some serious balls. Like, I read this verse where they confront Pharaoh about the difficulty, and I just can't believe that anyone would stand up to him like that. And we make jokes today in America about somebody crossing the government the wrong way and then going missing. But in the ancient world, you didn't have to just go missing, right? They would kill you on the spot if the leader didn't appreciate what you were saying. And I would imagine he had killed people for far less than saying, "You're the problem here, sir." Like, no matter what we think of the foremen and whether they were good guys, bad guys, just caught in a bad situation, they certainly had some guts and charisma to be able to approach the leader of Egypt and talk to him this way. And they present a very logical, reasonable argument. It makes complete sense to say, if we don't have straw and you're telling us to keep the same quota coming, that's not going to happen, right? One of these things needs to change. You either need to lower the quota or you gotta provide us straw. We can't keep doing the same thing with less product. Unless you think Pharaoh is some sort of cartoonish bad guy that could never be represented today, how many corporations in America do the same thing? How many people do we know who have seen layoffs in the company and then they're told to still make sure they meet the same quotas or possibly more? Or they get benefits taken away and they don't get a pay raise and they're still supposed to work just as hard. Like, that spirit of Pharaoh is still very alive and well in our world today. Something I find very fascinating in the way they approach Pharaoh is when they say, the fault is in your own people. That word fault is the Hebrew word for sin. And we've talked about this a little bit in our Genesis series, but despite all of the stories of abuse and murder and just people being absolutely terrible to each other in Genesis, there are actually very few times when the word sin shows up in Genesis. And this right here in Exodus 5 is actually only the 9th time the word sin has been used in the Bible up until this point. And it's just fascinating to me how much churches like the ones that I grew up in focused on sin. Like, they talked about sin more than they talked about anything else. And yet, that's not really the terminology that the biblical authors for Genesis and up until this point Exodus have really used for people mistreating each other. And I realize you don't have to use the word sin to be talking about sin, but I kind of appreciate how this gets us thinking of the ways that we can hurt each other as human beings without using that word sin. Because at least today, I think for a lot of us, sin has so much baggage to it. There's so much cultural connotation. Everyone has a different idea in their mind when you say the word sin. And so having this conversation, but using different terminology, gets us to think of the problem without all of that baggage. And it reminds us that sin isn't necessarily this ethereal concept of offending the big guy in the sky, as much as it is missing the mark in being the best human you can be. Verse 19 has some pretty funky King James wording here, starting off with, the officers of the children of Israel did see that they were in evil case. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you know this already, so congratulations to you. But anytime you see italics in an English Bible, particularly in some of the older translations, but there are a few newer ones that do this too, it suggests that that word was not in the original language, and that the translators had to supply it in order to make a smooth English translation. So we have a good deal of that here in verse 19. It would more literally read that the children of Israel saw they in evil. And it's just that. So you can kind of understand why the translators added in a few other words, because that is definitely not good English. But it works in Hebrew. And Robert Alter translated it as saw themselves coming to harm. I think that makes sense, and he's drawing off of the work of Abraham ibn Ezra and other ancient commentators. He said, still smarting from their recent whipping, they are acutely aware that they will be the first to suffer for the inability of the Hebrew slaves to maintain their usual quota of bricks. End quote. A second weird English wording that we have in this verse is minish. I'm sure pretty much everyone listening here is familiar with the word diminish, but if you look more closely at verse 19, it actually reads, "Ye shall not minish aught from the bricks of your daily task." This is why we have to read the text really carefully, because I can't tell you how many times I read this chapter, and I didn't realize that it was a different word being used right there. I just read it as diminish. It's so easy to just gloss over it and think you know what it said, but that's not what's actually there. Now, that being said, minish is actually just an archaic English form of diminish, so it does actually mean the same thing. And what's kind of amusing to me in this case, and I really wish I could time travel and sit down with the King James translators here and be like, what were you thinking? Because verse 8, and verse 11 for that matter, verse 8 and verse 11 use the exact same word, and they both translate it diminish. So we have the same word in 3 different verses, twice translated as diminish, once as minish, all in the same chapter. I know the King James translators like to have some variety in their translation, but all within the same chapter just kind of confuses things, in my opinion. So, same meaning, but slightly different form of the word in English. Oh, and speaking of archaic English words, I think I brought this up in the last episode, but I'll mention it here again because verse 18 had that word tale, the tale of bricks. It's basically a tally of bricks, a measurement of bricks, their quota, their number, just a different way of wording it there. Oh, and I also meant to draw attention back in verse 17, Pharaoh's response to the people, when he says, you're idle, you're idle. Again, look at the italics, and you'll notice the first R, and then actually ye are, in the next time, is italicized. So If you were looking at it in Hebrew, it's nirpim atem nirpim. And nirpim isn't actually an adjective like idle is in that particular use in English. It's a participle. And it does mean to be idle, to be lazy, to slack off. So really, it's saying slacking off, you. Slacking off. That's a literal rendering of it. And I just find that fascinating that he has this repetition like that right there. Because there's not a lot of times in the biblical story where characters will say the same thing back to back like that. And particularly in dialogue. So I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I just kind of read it in my head almost like he's talking over them. Like they're bringing their proposition to him, and before they can even finish what they're saying, he goes, slacking off. And they just keep talking. He's like, you're slacking off. He seems to think that people only have time to think about foreign gods when they are being lazy. Your desire for connection with the divine outside of how my establishment tells you should want that connection, that's just laziness. Your cultural practices that appear weird to me, self-indulgence masquerading as piety. This is how empire consistently operates. It pathologizes the humanity of those it oppresses. The very things that make you who you are become justification for why you deserve your condition. And that brings us up to verse 20, so let's take a quick pause there, and we'll come back and finish out the chapter. Now that Pharaoh has shot down the leaders of the people, they go to Moses. So let's read verse 20 and following. They met Moses and Aaron, who stood in the way as they came forth from Pharaoh. And they said to them, Yahweh look on you and judge, because you've made our savor to be abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, and put a sword in their hand to slay us. And Moses returned to Yahweh and said, Master, why have you so evil entreated this people? Why did you send me? For ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's done evil to this people, nor has he delivered your people at all. And that's how this chapter ends. I know I've been talking a lot about empire and oppression and all of that here in these verses, but that's just because that is what is in the biblical text. That is very much the message of liberation that the authors of Exodus were interested in sharing with us. And we're just not used to hearing that in a lot of American churches, because especially if you're someone who looks like me, which is a white male, you're not really used to needing to hear a message of liberation from oppression. And while that's a good thing that we haven't faced that kind of oppression, it's also suggesting that maybe there's a problem when we haven't heard that message in a while, because it suggests that maybe we're the ones who are now being oppressive to others. And so if this message sounds a little weird to you, a little foreign to be hearing Exodus as being about liberation from oppressive empire, that just shows how far off base we have gotten, because this book is literally about that. It is about salvation, deliverance, liberation from oppressive people who are not treating those under them well. And note how oppression leads to division. It is now pitting people from the same tribes against each other. Now it's not just Moses and Aaron against Pharaoh, but once again, these Hebrew foremen are caught in the middle, where they do not have friends in Pharaoh's court anymore, and they are seeing themselves as being up against Moses and Aaron as well. Alter writes, Moses and Aaron, who previously had acted as bold spokesmen, now wait awkwardly, perhaps even nervously, outside the palace, while the delegation of overseers brings its petition before Pharaoh. The verb for encounter, what the King James has as met, they met Moses and Aaron, it's the Hebrew word pagah, and it has both a neutral and a violent meaning. It indicates the meeting of persons or substances, including the meeting of forged iron with flesh, when it has the sense of stab or hit, as at the end of verse 3. End quote. So what Alter's saying there is when the text reads that they met Moses and Aaron, that can mean exactly that, but it also has a little bit of a dual meaning where it can be a violent encounter, and the same word in Hebrew is used for a sword stabbing someone's flesh, meeting their flesh. In a very real, visceral way, the words that Moses and Aaron had brought before Pharaoh were like weapons that stabbed, that met their own people with more violence, Perhaps because they didn't entirely follow the instructions of Yahweh. We talked about that in the past couple of chapters here. But we don't know entirely for sure why it didn't go well. We just know that it did not. And words are like weapons, and we don't always consider the effect our proclamations will have on other people. The foremen tell Moses that their savor is now abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh. That word savor, it means odor. So they're saying that we reek in Pharaoh's nostrils. And it's kind of funny that they're using a smell term while saying in the eyes of Pharaoh. So it's not that our savor is abhorrent in the nose of Pharaoh, but they use the Hebraism before his face, before the eyes of Pharaoh. It's kind of an entertaining mixed metaphor, because that in the eyes of someone is a Hebrew figure of speech to mean in front of them or in their presence. So the Egyptians were now despising the Israelites even more than they had before. Racism is now increasing in the land. And the people say to Moses that he has put a sword in the hand of the Egyptians to slay us. I can't help but think that maybe there's a little bit of a connection back to the beginning of the chapter when Moses claimed that Yahweh would bring a sword on his own people if Pharaoh didn't let them sacrifice to him out in the wilderness. It's like the people are saying, oh, you thought that God was going to send a sword against us? Well, actually, you are the sword, and you put it in the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 22 brings up a question that I don't think I've ever actually heard someone ask, but I thought about when I was doing my study for this. Moses returned to Yahweh and speaks to him, but where? Because when Moses spoke with Yahweh before, it was all the way out in Sinai, Mount Sinai, Korev. He certainly didn't go all the way back there. So where did he go that he returned to Yahweh? Obviously, he can talk to God wherever, but since it very specifically says that he returned to Yahweh, I just find that a fascinating choice of wording that makes us question where exactly did this happen. I mean, it's not like the tabernacle existed yet at this point, but the message that he brings to Yahweh, wherever this may be, is honestly just as harsh as the message that the Hebrew foreman brought before Pharaoh. A lot of English versions, including the King James, soften this verse. They'll read something along the lines of, why have you brought trouble or caused trouble to these people? Or the King James has, why have you so evil entreated this people? It literally reads, Master, why have you caused evil to this people? Remember that the Hebrew word for evil, it can mean moral evil. It can also just mean generic bad. Like if I had to tell you that one of your family members was in the hospital, that would be called evil news, raw news in Hebrew, even though there's no malicious force behind it, just because there's something bad to it. And in a way, that makes sense, because evil in the world was never meant to be. We weren't meant to suffer like that. So anything bad is a form of evil, in a sense, or at least a result of it. I certainly think you can take that logic out a little too far, but I think the general idea of it is saying that if we were made for an Eden-like existence, anything that goes wrong is not the way it was supposed to be. So it is evil that bad things happen, even if there's no actual malicious intent behind them. From this perspective, then, Moses might have been not accusing God of evil, per se, but rather of allowing bad things to happen without repercussions. Whichever position you want to take on that, whether he was actually saying that what God was doing was evil or just that it was wrong that he was allowing this evil to happen, that still, again, takes some serious balls. And I love that we have this kind of prayer in Scripture. I don't love that had to happen. I wish that the people involved in this story didn't have to experience that. But it shows us that we don't need these clean, refined, pretty little prayers that we tend to give God. I don't know about you, but so often in church, it was just these formulaic, generic prayers. Honestly, if you had been in church for 1 week, you had heard every variation of prayer that was possible. Because it was always just the, Lord, we thank you for this, and we have a request for this person's healing, and this person needs a new car, and thanks again for your salvation, and make sure this person gets back with you, and, that was it. And it was always this very respectful and oftentimes in Elizabethan English kind of style of prayer. But I think the majority of prayers in the Bible are a lot more of people just being like, WTF, God? Like, what do you think you're doing? And we've lost that in American Christianity. I completely get wanting to respect the creator of the universe, but that can go a little too far because he's not just our king, he's not just our creator, he's also our parent. And while I'm all for acknowledging those other titles, I am not for ignoring the parent one. It's like being a prince or a princess and not ever having a normal conversation with your parents because they're royalty. You know, acting as if you have to talk to them the way everyone else has to talk to them. Oh, there is a level of just conversation that they would have like normal people. And that's the way it's supposed to be with God as well. Don't let any church or any Christian leader ever tell you, whether purposefully or just by listening to the ways they pray, don't let anyone tell you that you can't approach God in just a very real, raw way. Sometimes we have to get those emotions out, and it's okay to have those WTF God moments, and it's okay to talk to him like that. If he really is God, he can handle it, and he's not going to be offended by that. He wants you to cry out for injustice. I mean, just think back to the first, I think it's the end of the first chapter here, where it says that he remembered the people because he heard their cry. If you're not being real with God, don't expect God to be real with you. All right, set aside the little playtime that is so much of American Christianity and just be yourself. Who do you think you're fooling trying to be a little more presentable before God? If you really think he sees everything, knows everything, that means he sees you right when you wake up in the morning and you have morning breath and your hair's wild and your brain hasn't woken up yet. All right? And he can accept you at that point just as much as he can when you're all dolled up in your Sunday best. So let's just stop with this ridiculousness that assumes you need to be this clean, polished version before God. And just be yourself. Don't expect God to be real with you if you won't be real with him. Be more like Moses here. It's not wrong to complain to God. It's not wrong to ask God why. I mean, Moses literally talked with God on the mountain, right? He got his commission from God directly. I mean, we don't know exactly how much time passed between this and that passage, but, you know, maybe a month, maybe a couple months. It certainly hasn't been a year. At least I would imagine not. But whether it's been a few days or a few years, right? He had this encounter with God, and here he is saying, why did you send me? He knows why God sent him. We read why God sent him, and yet he's asking that. And that's okay. It is okay for us to question God. Nothing whatsoever in this text suggests that Moses was wrong for asking these questions or for talking to God so brazenly. And in fact, I remember back when we had the conversation about his talk with God on Sinai, he asked a lot of questions of God, and it wasn't until, I think the fifth time, when God responds angrily, and then he very quickly cools down. It's like, all right, I shouldn't have talked to you like that. So we have, again, no indication that God is angry with Moses for asking him these questions. And even in verse 23, when he uses very strong language, the King James says, neither have you delivered your people at all. There's a Hebrew construction that we've talked about a handful of times now on the podcast called an infinitive absolute, where you take two words stemming from the same root and put them next to each other, and it creates an intensive statement. It would be like saying in English, running, I ran to the store. Or, I guess more technically, to run, I ran to the store. And we wouldn't really construct it that way in English. It doesn't sound right. But in Hebrew, that doubling creates emphasis. So Moses uses that sort of construction, and he literally says, to rescue, you have not rescued your people. Or in more colloquial terms, you ain't done none of what you said you would. The grammar mirrors his frustration. And with that and nothing more, the chapter ends. Moses' accusation just hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. We don't get God's response until chapter 6. Now, I have stated several times in the podcast that chapter and verse divisions aren't inspired scripture. They're more modern additions. And that's true. But I do think there is something profound about this particular break. The chapter division creates a literary space, a pause that forces us to sit with the discomfort that Moses is feeling. to really feel the weight of his words and the apparent silence from God. Because how often in our own lives do we throw our accusations at heaven and get nothing? No immediate answer, no dramatic intervention, just what feels like the echo of our own voice in an empty room. But here's the thing about chapters, both literary and in life. They're artificial breaks in a continuous narrative. The story doesn't actually stop. It's more like a line break in poetry. It shapes meaning by creating pause and emphasis, but it's artificial. The chapter doesn't actually end there. The story certainly doesn't. And while I don't like to spiritualize too much in this podcast, I think it brings up a really worthwhile point. And it's that no matter how a chapter of your life may seem to end, a flip of the page is often all it takes to bring you into the next chapter. And what we'll find for Moses in this case, and what we'll often find for ourselves too, is that God is ready and waiting with his answer. If you have not found life to be going the way that you want it to, just remember, the story isn't over. And there is another chapter in the book of your life that will bring more love, redemption, grace, and liberation that you maybe have not yet seen. There is one little intriguing historical possibility that I want to throw in here as we've been talking about this chapter. Back in the beginning of the series, I mentioned how we cannot know for sure who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, both of the first couple chapters of the Exodus and of this part of Exodus right here. But if you take one of the later dates, or at least anything that is slightly after the early date, because the early date is usually around 1446 BC, about 100 years after that, so like the 1330s-ish, there's a pharaoh named Akhenaten, or sometimes Amenhotep IV. He only reigned for about 17 years, and he was not a popular guy at all. You may have heard of his wife, though, Nefertiti, and we're not really 100% sure which pharaoh came after him, but it is possible it was actually King Tut, Tutankhamun, after that. But again, that's uncertain. Back to Akhenaten. He was really disliked because he shifted the entirety of the Egyptian religion away from the polytheism of all of its gods to more of a monolatrous worship of one god in particular named Aten. Aten was a sun god and in many ways connected to Ra. It can be a little hard to distinguish them completely at times, but Akhenaten was so in favor of this one particular deity that he made that the only state religion, if you will, of ancient Egypt in his time. And the people did not like that at all. So pretty much as soon as he died, any record of his doing any of that was like wiped out. He had like some of his statues were torn down, records were destroyed. In fact, King Tut would have been the one who then re-established the worship of the former pantheon of gods after Akhenaten's death. So again, we can't know for sure when the Exodus was, so whether it would have been before Akhenaten, after, or maybe significantly after, we don't really know. But if it would have happened around the time of Akhenaten, maybe 100 years after, 50 to 100 years after him, I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the harsh response of this pharaoh against Yahweh could maybe have been a reaction to Akhenaten's failed monotheistic reform. Akhenaten's attempt to impose the worship of Aten was catastrophic for Egypt. It destabilized the kingdom, it was rejected by the people, and it was quickly reversed after his death. So if our Pharaoh of this Exodus story lived through that, perhaps, or inherited the aftermath of it, his visceral reaction to another foreign monotheistic god challenging Egyptian religious authority makes considerable sense. Power that has been recently threatened becomes especially vicious in its response. So again, there is no way that we can know for sure any of that informed this particular story, but it's a fascinating theory. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So go ahead, reach out and share with us what you think about that in our socials this week, or email cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can reach out on the homepage of our website, and we have a Discord up now too, where we can talk about this episode and other related topics. Those links are in the show notes on your favorite podcast player. This chapter that we have talked through here really shows us two contrasting models of leadership under pressure. Pharaoh, when confronted with the logical consequence of his policies, dug his heels in deeper. He increased oppression, shifted blame to the victims, and refused to acknowledge systemic problems. But when Moses was confronted by the harm his actions caused to the people, he got alone to rethink and make sure he was doing the right thing. Notice how he didn't defend himself to the people or blame them for not understanding his God-given role. Rather, he took the accusations to heart and went back to reevaluate with God if he truly understood what he was supposed to be doing. This distinction matters so much because we will all get things wrong sometimes in life. But what matters is what you do once that has been brought to your attention. And so many people, whether just in daily life or in a church especially, when they think they have God on their side and some higher calling to do a particular thing, they like to dig their heels in and say, we're right, we know we're right, you're in the wrong, you're lazy, it's your belief about God that's causing the problem, or what have you, just like Pharaoh. But true humility and good leadership and just good humanity does what Moses does. It steps aside and says, all right, let me reevaluate. Let me see if there's something to what you've been saying here, if I've actually caused harm. Moses doesn't victim blame like Pharaoh. He doesn't gaslight. He says, all right, maybe you're right. Let me go double check, make sure I'm actually in the right here. Which one are you going to be this week? Pharaoh or Moses? The moral of the story this week? Liberation is messy. It doesn't happen in one big dramatic moment. It's a struggle. And sometimes things get way worse before they get any better. Just like life, Exodus is not a story of quick fixes. It's a story of transformation. Change is slow. Oppression fights back. But the seeds of liberation have now been planted. And the question is, when we find ourselves in shoes like Moses, will we press forward or will we turn back to familiar dysfunction? This chapter told the story of two leaders confronted by the harm they caused, one who dug his heels in and the other who got alone to rethink and make sure he was doing the right thing. And the chapter reminds us too that even when heaven seems silent, the story isn't over. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the space between accusation and answer, between chapter and verse, if you will, between Friday and Sunday, to put it in Christian terms. Now next time, when we are in chapter 6, we're going to get to hear God's response to Moses' challenge. We're also going to ponder whether or not the patriarchs really knew who their God was. And we'll encounter what might be the strangest placed genealogy in all of Scripture. I know that's a real hard sell right there, right? Come back next week and hear me talk about a list of names. But hopefully you have listened to some of our other episodes where we've talked through genealogies and you know they're not as scary or boring as they sound. So there's actually some really cool stuff we'll get to talk about then. But until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.